Back at it again with the old Mobius Dickus, Chapter 10, A Bosom Friend. Jumping right into it, I want to talk about Ishmael's obviously interesting observations of and phrenological analysis of Queequeg in paragraph 3. So here we go. With much interest I sat watching Queequeg. Savage though he was and hideously marred about the face, at least to my taste, his countenance yet had a something in it which was by no means disagreeable. You cannot hide the soul. Through all his unearthly tattooings, I thought I saw the traces of a simple, honest heart, and in his large, deep eyes, fiery, black, and bold, there seemed tokens of a spirit that would dare 1,000 devils. And besides all this, there was a certain lofty bearing about the pagan, which even his uncouthness could not altogether maim. He looked like a man who had never cringed, and never had a creditor. Whether it was, too, that his head being shaved, his forehead was drawn out in freer and brighter relief, and looked more expansive than it otherwise would, this I will not venture to decide. But certain it was his head was phrenologically, which, if you're curious, references phrenology, which was the pseudo-scientific analysis of skull shape to determine character traits. An excellent one. It may seem ridiculous, but it reminded me of General Washington's head, as seen in the popular busts of him. It had the same regularly graded, retreating slope from above the brows, which were likewise very projecting, like two long promontories thickly wooded on top. Queequeg was George Washington, cannibalistically developed. So in terms of knowledge and truth, I think there's two things here. One is shallower than the other. The shallow one is just the absurdity of phrenology as a mode of inquiry. And I think the comparison to George Washington gives us a clue that this is a tongue-in-cheek reference to phrenology, which is a very silly and pseudo-scientific way of determining people's characteristics. And obviously Ishmael has so many things different from George Washington that to say that he is like George Washington because his skull has a similar shape is taking a big leap in terms of the old knowledge claim. But I think it also raises an interesting question of interpreting people's inner beings. Can we know anything about other people's inside characters, especially just by looking at them? Logic seems to say no, obviously. How could you tell something about someone just by looking at them? But Ishmael's hunches contradict this because it turns out that he's, correct. And sometimes we hit it off with people we meet for the very first time, or we feel drawn to talk to someone and then turns out they're super cool. Does that mean that those are simply just instances where we actually get lucky that the other person is cool, and that anytime we have a social interaction, we simply open ourselves to being completely wrong all the time, and we're just randomly delighted when people are actually cool and interesting? Or is there some subconscious, weird animal knowledge of people's character that we've developed and just aren't aware of? Is there some kind of deeply subconscious ability to judge what type of person someone is just by looking at their outwards appearance? I think you want to say no because of that universal maxim that all kids are taught, right? Don't judge a book by its cover. But at least I'll have the courage to admit, and I'm curious whether you would too, I'll certainly admit that there are many people who I look at the way they're dressed or the way they're acting or the way they're talking, and I say, okay, I'll definitely get along with this person. Whereas some other people, I'm just right off the bat, I know that it's just probably not going to be great between us. So it raises an interesting question about what the limits of our interpersonal knowledge is, not philosophically or metaphysically, but just in terms of the mode of relating to a person. How do we come to get our first impressions about someone? Okay, to the orange passage, where stuff starts to get really interesting, right? Ishmael is talking about Queequeg and is saying that this guy just strikes me as being super wise and super chill. And it says, here was a man some 20,000 miles from home, by the way of Cape Horn, that is, which was the only way you could get there, thrown among people as strange to him as though he were in the planet Jupiter. And yet he seemed entirely at his ease, preserving the utmost serenity, content with his own companionship, always equal to himself, very Emersonian, if you will. Surely this was a touch of fine philosophy. And then here's why I marked this orange for interesting. Though no doubt he had never heard there was such a thing as that. But perhaps to be true philosophers, we mortals should not be so conscious of living or so striving. As soon as I hear that such or such a man gives himself out for a philosopher, I conclude that, like the dyspeptic old woman, he must have, quote, broken his digester. So that's a pun on digester. Digester meaning first, like, like a gastrointestinal system digests things, hence dyspeptic, which means having indigestion, but also broken his digester. The brain digests information. So someone who calls themselves a philosopher, Ishmael says, must, kind of have lost or kind of be a stupid guy. And I think this is just I could have marked this blue too because I find it funny, but I also find it so true that as you go through life, especially when you go to college, you're going to encounter these random people who say they're into philosophy or they dig philosophy, but they can't name anyone besides Plato, who, if you actually read primary source Plato, it's not super enthralling. Or like Descartes, and they say, like, I think therefore I am, and then you ask them like more about that and they're like, hey, I think therefore I am. Or they have like a basic understanding of like solipsism or nihilism, so they say, oh yeah, man, I just think that nothing is true, bro, like, isn't that like crazy, man? And I think what you take from this passage, which I find it fascinating that Melville already knew it in 1851, some things don't change, and certainly it's true in 2020, that the best way to find someone who is a philosopher is how they think, not how they label themselves. Like, you're going to find people who are dope-ass philosophers who are computer science majors. And you're going to find people who are horrible philosophers, who are English majors and philosophy majors. And just so it's clear that I'm egalitarian in this discussion, you're also going to find many great philosophers who are English and philosophy majors, and you're also going to find terrible philosophers who are computer science majors. It's more about how you think than how you label yourself. And I and Melville, it seems, are both pretty gosh darn skeptical about people who label themselves before acting or showing their true nature. Okay, Orange passage number 2 is going to move us to the main theme of this particular chapter, which is about the power and prominence or desirability of that concept that we described in previous chapters called sympathy, or what the 19th century would have referred to as sympathy. Okay, so let's read the passage, then I'll explain. I felt a melting in me. No more my splintered heart and maddened hand were turned against the wolfish world, right? Obviously drawing on the figurative association of wolves with viciousness or cruelty. This soothing savage, a nice little alliterative phrase there, had redeemed it. There he sat, his very indifference, speaking a nature in which there lurked no civilized hypocrisies and bland deceits. Wild he was, a very sight of sights to see, yet I began to feel myself mysteriously drawn towards him. And those same things that would have repelled most others, they were the very magnets that thus drew me. I'll try a pagan friend, thought I, since Christian kindness has proved but hollow courtesy. I drew my bench near him and made some friendly signs and hints, doing my best to talk with him meanwhile. At first he noticed these advances, but presently, upon my referring to his last night's hospitalities, he made out to ask me whether we were again to be bedfellows. I told him yes, whereat I thought he looked pleased, perhaps a little complimented. So they sit down and they start smoking together, and then things, continue, and they get closer and closer, and then it says he seemed to take me quite as naturally and unbiddenly as I to him, and when our smoke was over, he pressed his forehead against mine, clasped me around the waist, and said that henceforth we were married, meaning in his country's phrase that we were bosom friends. He would gladly die for me if need should be. In a countryman, this sudden flame of friendship would have seemed far too premature, a thing to be much distrusted. But in the simple savage, those old rules would not apply. So going back to that 19th century notion of sympathy, it's the idea that human relations are best ethically created and framed through emotion and feeling, as opposed to reason or rationality. It's kind of a 19th century hippieism, which says, why don't we all just get along, man? And this passage seems to imply that there's a lot to say for sympathy as a mode of relationship to other people. It has a pretty powerful effect on Ishmael, and it doesn't seem half bad. The power and depth of Queequeg's oath seems to imply, the possibly powerful nature of sympathy to create real connections, even between people from drastically different backgrounds. Additionally, I want to emphasize how the rhetoric surrounding sympathy is contrasted with civilization or society, right? Ishmael describes society as civilized hypocrisy or bland deceit, or that in a countryman, this flame of friendship would have seemed too premature a thing to be distrusted. But it's only once Ishmael leaves the constraints of society, which are, I think, circumscribed by these moral frameworks based in tradition, based in history, based in logic, and he moves back to a kind of more primal return to the land, another very hippie-ish quality that's shared here, a kind of return to the quote-unquote uncivilized Queequeg, that instead of regressing to a mode of relation to other people which is somehow like savage or violent or problematic, it actually goes the opposite direction, and the further he gets from society, the more in touch with other people he is. That obviously is an idea that I'm not saying is explicitly stolen from, but is shared in that conception with transcendentalism, which says, man is born free, but everywhere he is enchained. So perhaps if we escape societies, and that's actually not transcendentalism, that's Rousseau, but if we escape this tendency of society to garner relationships between people in this very structured and very stultified and very formal, almost puritanical for New England way, then we will return to the power of sympathy to unite people even across very different intellectual and societal backgrounds like Ishmael and Queequeg. Okay, on to the next passage, where Ishmael is trying to decide whether he will take part in his new friend Queequeg's religious ceremony. And I find this passage really, really funny and interesting as he sees Queequeg making his sacrifice to the idol, and he has to decide whether he's going to comply. And he says, "I was a good Christian, born and bred in the bosom of the infallible Presbyterian Church. How then could I unite with this wild idolater in worshipping his piece of wood? But what is worship, thought I? Do you suppose now, Ishmael, that the magnanimous God of heaven and earth, pagans and all included, can possibly be jealous of an insignificant bit of black wood? Impossible. But what is worship? To do the will of God. That is worship. And what is the will of God? To do my fellow man what I would have my fellow man do to me. That is the will of God. Now Queequeg is my fellow man, and what I do wish that this Queequeg would do to me, why unite with me in my particular Presbyterian form of worship. Consequently, I must then unite with him in his. Ergo, I must turn idolater. So I kindled the shavings, helped prop up the innocent little idol, offered him burnt biscuit with Queequeg, salaamed before him twice or thrice, kissed his nose, and that done, we undressed and went to bed, at peace with our consciences and all the world. But we did not go to sleep without some little chat." So I think for me, this passage is a pretty hilarious but also really powerful demonstration of what I would call the malleability of reason. So malleability is a word that means the shapeability or the flexibility of reason. So how can Ishmael possibly logically find a way to justify doing very non-Christian stuff when the first commandment is that you shall take no other gods but me? Well, I think the point here being made by Melville pretty hilariously is that logic and reason have this funny capacity to justify pretty much anything. So it's a funny passage, and I find it somewhat telling about logic and reason as justifiers for action or constructors of meaning. They're so flexible that you can justify pretty much anything. And obviously the writing structure here is what gives me the link to logic and reason. Not only is Ishmael asking questions about what he should do and thinking about it, which any thinking would have a link to logic and reason, but notice the consistent logical step-by-step thinking. What is worship? What is the will of God? What is what I want Queequeg to do unto me? Ipso facto, and he even uses the classical logical phrase ergo, right? Therefore, which shows the step from premise to conclusion. So I think it's not necessarily a critique, it's just an observation about just how flexible reason and logic can be as justifications for truth. Okay, and then finally, to finish out the chapter, I could have marked this passage in blue, but it says, "How is it I know not, but there is a place like a bed, for no place like a bed, for confidential disclosures between friends. Man and wife, they say, they're open the very bottom of their souls to each other, and some old couples often lie and chat over old times till nearly morning. Thus, then in our... Oops, went backwards. Then in our heart's honeymoon lay I and Queequeg, a cozy, loving pair." I think it is funny, but it's really earnest and heartfelt. Anyone who has had a really good friend knows the depth of honesty and sharing of one's emotions and thoughts and feelings that you can do with someone that you really connect with, like Ishmael and Queequeg have connected through their sympathy. Yes, there are critics who will read this as, "Oh my God, he calls them like a married couple and they go to bed together. Clearly they're gay." I don't think so. I mean, you're welcome to interpret that. I'm not sure what it adds to the book. But nevertheless, I find it earnest. I find it interesting and pretty touching. All right. That was chapter 10, A Bosom Friend, in the books. See you in chapter 11.